The view, which a moment before had seemed miraculously fixed, was now unsatisfactory. Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I'd like to share my impressions of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which I reread this past week, absolutely loved. Again, it is an absolute touchstone in modernist literature, 20th century literature, and it is a book that I'm going to be reading in every decade of my life because I enjoy it so much. But I use the word impressions with intention because this is a book in which Virginia Woolf fuses Impressionism with all of her other modernist literary techniques. It is a book in which she I think, lays out her artistic statement in part 3, The Lighthouse, through the character of Lily Briscoe. I think Woolf lays out what her purpose is as an artist, as someone who crafts novels, who tries to push the envelope of what art can do in this form. And so it's a book that I think is just has an incredible grasp of technique, of emotion, and of power. And it is a book in which Impressionism is fused with modernism, is fused with stream of consciousness. Woolf in earlier essays had laid out ideas around, well, there might be some issues with the novels as they were being written in the 1900s and the 1910s, and that she maybe wanted to try something different and wanted to be able to read works that were a little different. And this, along with Mrs. Dalloway, were the books where she really laid out what different could look like and what it could sound like. So this is a book I love. The first part is really, really fascinating, but it's also incredibly difficult. If you've ever read Woolf before, I don't know if this is the place to start, in part because of how challenging part 1 actually is. The way that the stream of consciousness bounces from character to character is extraordinary. In part 2, time passes. We have a total shift. We are suddenly centered around this cottage at the seaside, not the lighthouse, but this cottage at the seaside. And we're seeing how time is passing. Nature is almost the main character. The cottage is the main character. The characters we were introduced to in part 1, we find out what's happening to them, but that action is not central to where Woolf is going and what she's interested in, the ideas she's expressing there. And then finally in part 3, the lighthouse, we have moved forward and we see how time has ravaged these characters and shifted their perspectives, in fascinating ways. And it is there that we get this culminating, I think, statement of purpose, statement of art from the character of Lily Briscoe. But I wanted to just give a sense of what's happening in each of those. So in part 1, part of what makes it so challenging from the stream of consciousness is that the stream of consciousness is not explicitly built out as we're in one character's mind and we're just following that character around the way that we do sort of in the works of James Joyce or in other modernist writers, Proust. We're not doing that. We're also not doing what Faulkner had done would do in As I Lay Dying, where he was breaking off the stream of consciousness with discrete chapters. And so in a certain chapter, it's Darl's consciousness, in another, it's Vardman's, in another, it's Dewey Dill's consciousness. That's not happening as well. Here, it'll sometimes break on the chapters, sometimes it'll continue on the chapters, sometimes it'll break in the chapter. And so I just want to give a sense of where that's going. So in chapter 3, we're in one character's mind. Only Lily Briscoe she was glad to find, and that did not matter. But the sight of the girl standing on the edge of the lawn painting kept reminding her. She was supposed to be keeping her head as much in the same position as possible for Lily's picture. Lily's picture, Mrs. Ramsay smiled. And so we're in Mrs. Ramsay's consciousness, and it goes on and finishes. Mrs. Ramsay liked her for it, so remembering her promise, she bent her head. Chapter 4. Indeed, he almost knocked her easel over, coming down upon her with his hands waving, shouting out, "Boldly we rode and well," but mercifully he turned sharp and rode off to die gloriously, she supposed, upon the heights of Balaclava. Never was anybody at once so ridiculous and so alarming. But so long as he kept like that, waving, shouting, she was safe. He would not stand still and look at her picture, and that was what Lily Briscoe could not have endured. So we know now that chapter shifted us, along with the very jarring, indeed, he almost knocked her easel over. And along with that very jarring shift, we are now shifted to someone else's consciousness. And so we stay with the character of Lily Briscoe for a couple of pages, and then we're introduced 3 pages later to this statement where she's with another character, They came there regularly every evening, drawn by some need. It was as if the water floated off and set sailing thoughts which had grown stagnant on dry land, and gave to their bodies even some sort of physical relief. And we now have a they. We still seem to be in Lily Briscoe's consciousness, but she's sharing this sensation with someone else. It's in her mind, but it's a sense that is being shared with someone else. And this they continues for 2 paragraphs. They both smiled standing there. They both felt a common hilarity, excited by the morning waves, and then by the swift cutting race of a sailing boat, which, having sliced a curve in the bay, stopped, shivered, let its sails drop down, and then, with a natural instinct to complete the picture, after this swift movement, both of them looked at the dunes far away, and instead of merriment, felt come over them some sadness, because the thing was completed partly, and partly because distant views seemed to outlast by 1,000,000 years, Lily thought, the gazer, and to be communing already with a sky which beholds an earth entirely at rest. In the next paragraph, looking at the far sand hills, William Banks thought of Ramsay, thought of a road in Westmoreland, thought of Ramsay striding along a road by himself. And so we're in one character's consciousness, the chapter broke, we're in a new character's consciousness. We're with that character for 3 pages. Then there's 2 paragraphs of they. We're confirmed that we're still in that character's consciousness. The paragraph break leads us to a new character's consciousness. The closest way I can describe the stream of consciousness into the Lighthouse Part 1 and Part 3 is really that of characters who are almost playing soccer or hockey together, or basketball. And the way that stream of consciousness is basically a ball that's being passed between them. Someone has it and is carrying it a certain way up the field or up the court or up the ice, and then suddenly it's passed off to somebody else. And sometimes it gets passed right back. But usually it'll stay with that character for a little bit longer. And that quick, rapid shift is something that can be very hard if you're not paying attention. This is not a book to read while listening to a bunch of music or idly having a conversation or watching the television or whatever one does while reading. And I think it's probably also hard to experience stream of consciousness, as I've said a couple of times in other videos, while through an audiobook. I do think that is challenging. I think it's hard to catch the different shifts unless the narrator is suddenly shifting the register quite a bit and the tone of voice to share that. So it's something to just pay attention to. Part 1 is incredible. The way Woolf explores stream of consciousness, the little dinner she creates there is something incredible. It was something that in her letters she wrote about being very proud of. But then in Part 2, we have this totally different sensation. We are told what is happening to characters from Part 1. A couple of them die, and we're just told that very suddenly, parenthetically. I won't say who for folks who've never read it, but it's worth reading and exploring. So here's one of the chapters from Part 2. Night after night, summer and winter, the torment of storms, the arrow-like stillness of fine weather held their court without interference. Listening, had there been anyone to listen? From the upper rooms of the empty house, only gigantic chaos streaked with lightning could have been heard tumbling and tossing as the winds and waves disported themselves like the amorphous bulks of leviathans, whose brows are pierced by no light of reason, and mounted one on top of another, and lunged and plunged in the darkness or the daylight. For night and day, month and year, ran shapelessly together, in games until it seemed as if the universe were battling and tumbling in brute confusion and wanton lust aimlessly by itself. In spring, the garden urns, casually filled with wind-blown plants, were gay as ever. Violets came and daffodils, but the stillness and the brightness of the day were as strange as the chaos and tumult of night, with the tree standing there and the flowers standing there, looking before them, looking up, yet beholding nothing, eyeless and so terrible. And there's something truly terrifying about the nature that is expressed and the violence, the just totally careless violence of the world and of nature and of erosion and of time upon this house. We see what happens when people aren't living in a house for years, how things decay and shift. We see the 2 characters who are paid to periodically go in and clean things. We see what's happening there. But there is something that is remorseless, that is inevitable about these shifts, about these changes. And that's what Woolf is focusing on. Characters are dispensed with in a single sentence, parenthetically here. When we find out who's no longer with the family that we were introduced to in Part 1, but there's a real sense of what is happening to the house, to the garden that characters had taken care of and had spent years planting and keeping up, and now it's just overrun. And what happens then, suddenly the great shift in action, this spring into action, literally for the season, but also for the characters who are told, hey, we're coming back, get it cleaned up, and what they have to go through, and what their perception is of that. And so there's something that's quite incredible about part 2, Time Passes. It really is this fusion. If part 1 was fusing Impressionism with modernism, part 2 is really fusing the sense of the pastoral from centuries before, that sense of poetry and of the romantics suddenly being fused with modernism. And then we have part 3, where we see the characters who are still alive, and there's a couple of characters who launch out now to finally take the journey to the lighthouse that they had been talking about on the very first page, the way that they had started this novel. There's a group of characters who do set off for the lighthouse, but there's another character who I think in some sense represents part of Woolf's sense of herself, who's a painter, not a writer, but who has this sense of artistry. And that is the painter Lily Bristow. And she says, love had 1,000 shapes. There might be lovers whose gift it was to choose out the elements of things and place them together, and so giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, make of some scene or meeting of people all now gone and separate, one of those globed, compacted things over which thought lingers and love plays. And I think that is what Woolf is doing here. She's taking her impressions, her memories of her parents. Very explicitly, she states it in her letters that Mrs. Ramsay is based on her mother, Mr. Ramsay is based in part on her father and her memories and impressions of them, but she brings in impressions of her sister, Vanessa, and adds those characteristics to Mrs. Ramsay as well. And so she's taken these little bits and pieces of her life, her experiences, her imagination as well, and then fused them together, compacted them, giving them a wholeness not theirs in life, and then something over which thought lingers and love plays. And that's what this book is. It is something that our thought lingers upon. And the way that the humanity that is expressed within it plays upon our emotions. We see characters falling in and out of love, or not quite making it into love, and we recognize that in our own lives. And then to go on and think about how there is this sense of change, because the very next paragraph talks about how she's been watching this boat traveling out towards the lighthouse. Her eyes rested on the brown speck of Mr. Ramsay's sailing boat. They would be at the lighthouse by lunchtime, she supposed. But the wind had freshened, and as the sky changed slightly, and the sea changed slightly, and the boats altered their positions, the view, which a moment before had seemed miraculously fixed, was now unsatisfactory. The wind had blown the trail of smoke about. There was something displeasing about the placing of the ships. The disproportion there seemed to upset some harmony in her own mind. She felt an obscure distress. It was confirmed when she turned to her picture. She had been wasting her morning. For whatever reason, she could not achieve that razor edge of balance between two opposite forces. And she thinks about, is it design? Is it mass? What is it? What is the problem there? But there's something about how she talks about the idea that the sky has changed, the sea has changed. And that's what she was doing all throughout part 1 and then again in part 3, and expressing this lengthened time in part 2, this idea that we constantly are having impressions that shift, and we think we have found this brilliant, happy moment, this moment that captures what we want, and then suddenly life happens. Things change. The moment is lost, as we say, cliche. As Heraclitus said, no man walks through the same river twice. There is something that is ever shifting, and that Woolf is capturing into the lighthouse. So, as I said, I think this is a masterpiece. I put it right up there with Mrs. Dalloway. I love both of them. I'd be curious to know what others think of these books. And as I said, I think this is the one where she really lays out her artistic statement. She was very proud of the dinner party scene, but there were other ways in which I think she felt that the book wouldn't be received well. So it's one that I, though, really, really do enjoy. I love the way that the characters are playing off of each other in ways that introduce deep ironies about one character just absolutely despising another, or one character falling in love with another, and the other character has no idea and is oblivious. So it's one I love. In terms of other works, read Mrs. Dalloway. I think Mrs. Dalloway is a little bit easier to get a handle on, despite the fact that it again has that stream of consciousness I think it's a little more discreet in its shifts than To the Lighthouse is. The Waves is far more experimental. I would say read both of those before embarking upon The Waves. Between the Acts is a later novel that is, in some way, it feels very influenced by Jane Austen, but is very effective, and I think contains some really interesting ways to approach Woolf. Despite it being a later work, it's also, I think, one of her more approachable works. I mentioned, of course, As I Lay Dying, which I think is one of Faulkner's best novels, but can also be, again, very challenging to keep track of what's going on, despite the fact that here, at least, we have characters who are named and we know whose stream of consciousness we're in. The sense of the pastoral, the sense of that fusion of modernism and nature and human emotion and what's happening outside in the environment is very prevalent in the stories of Katherine Mansfield. I highly, highly recommend these. And I think Woolf is a great contrast to James Joyce. Certainly the epiphanies, whether in Dubliners or in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, are interesting. There is that really conscientious shift where Woolf is not strictly like pushing her own autobiography. She talks about the memories of her mother who had died when she was 13, and how she can only dimly recall these certain facets that she tries to produce in the novel, but she knows she's drawing on other memories to create these as well. And I think there's a real way in which part 3 of To the Lighthouse is almost not a portrait of the artist as a young man, but a portrait of the artist as a middle-aged woman in some ways, and a response in some ways to Joyce and what he was doing. Other writers who I was reminded of, certainly Henry Green, whether it's Party Going or Loving, I think each of these has elements that are owe a debt to Virginia Woolf in the best way possible. I think Henry Green was a marvelous writer. The titular long story, In the Heart of the Country by William Gass, reminded me a lot of part 2. Now, in terms of some other works, certainly Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano, the way that we have these characters and their consciousness and the way that memory is drawn back and then we're brought forward is very similar. I think there was a way in which To the Lighthouse almost takes what EM Forster was doing with Howard's End and just shifts it into this totally different gear that Forster was never really writing for. We have a place, both the titular Howard's End and the seaside cottage by the lighthouse, but the way that Woolf is focused on the interiority of the characters at the expense of their action and at the expense of the changes and what they are doing, but rather what are they thinking. Of course, we have characters here where Forster's like crying out, connect, and Woolf has characters who connect or fail to connect. Iris Murdoch's The Sea. I think there's a clear through line with what Murdoch was trying to kind of return to 19th century and pre-19th century novels with Woolf in mind, like seeing what Woolf had done and wanting to absorb some of that, but cycle back to some of those more traditional novel structures. Later on in this century, we have Ian McEwan, I would say, with Atonement or Saturday, probably even on Chesil Beach. There's a clear debt to Woolf. Thinking as well, Toni Morrison, perhaps Love, the way that we see the shifting memories and perceptions from different points of view of characters to find out what was really happening. With Morrison, it's about this sense of life and of catching on. But with Woolf, it was I think there is a difference in terms of what they were going for. With Proust, the writings about the seaside, about the characters and their emotions, but also the level of description reminds me of Proust, especially his recollections of visiting Normandy and the beach with his grandmother in the second volume, In the Shadow of Young Girls and Flower, which is just a really marvelous one. The way that Tolstoy writes about characters who are trying to figure out what it means to connect with somebody else and failing at that, I think in some ways in Anna Karenina reminded me of To the Lighthouse. I had mentioned, of course, Woolf's letters, where she writes in her letters about the way she's worried about the lighthouse. She's writing it rapidly, but she's worried about how it will be perceived. And then finally, the way that she, of course, views the pastoral tradition, whether it's John Keats or Percy Shelley, and the way that they fuse that with a really strange sensibility in the Romantic era, or with the essays and sort of the way that Carlyle had cast his influence upon literature and education and society, English society across the 19th century and into the 20th, and how Woolf felt that her Bloomsbury group was doing something different, and was not necessarily a response to Carlyle, but I think in advance from Carlyle. So as I said, let me know if you've read this one. I really, really do enjoy this book. I find it to be a true marvel. And I'll close with one final sentence where she notes, "It was a miserable machine, an inefficient machine, she thought, the human apparatus for painting or for feeling. It always broke down at the critical moment. Heroically, one must force it on." And thank goodness Woolf forced it on, because this came out of it. So I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.